Hi, this is my second venture into video lecturing. I thought I would do a very brief overview of Cicero's arrangement theory offered in The Invention. So I had to read book 1. It has 55 sections in it. Our text only includes 1 through 29, and arrangement starts at the end of section 14 on page 266. So you might want to look at this while we're talking. The text actually only goes through the beginning of arrangement, and there are a few sections that were in the sections from 29 to 55 that cover the rest of arrangement. So he introduces arrangement at the end of section 14. It is a very process-oriented sort of digression. He says basically that just because you start the speech with the exordium, that is, the presentation starts with the exordium, does not mean you need to start the writing of the speech with the exordium, which is one of those things that I often find myself reminding students. And I thought it was pretty interesting that he would make that point as well. So at that point, at the end of section 14, he lists the 6 parts of classical arrangement: exordium, narration, division, confirmation, refutation, and peroration. So basically, the exordium is the introduction, or if you're going to be indirect, he says it's the insinuation. The narration tells the background story. The division states the main points of the argument. The confirmation provides evidence for the argument. The refutation brings up and then addresses objections to the argument. And then the peroration concludes. This is really not a surprising kind of structure. It's really probably what you find yourself doing in many situations. Obviously not calling them these Latin terms, but we can see actually where our English terms come from, some of the from the Latin, where you can see exhort inside exordium. Obviously narration is the same. Well, at least in terms of the translator. The terms division and confirmation may seem a little confusing because he means something particular about them, not necessarily what you might think of by those terms in everyday English. So we're going to talk about exordium. This starts at section 15. And the section on exordium, like all the sections, are pretty long, because the thing about Cicero is that he comes up with every single possible situation. But I'm going to focus on the overall statements that he says about each of these parts of a speech. So an exordium is a passage which brings the mind of the auditor into a proper condition to receive the rest of the speech. So the entire discussion of exordium really is about how you adapt, how you think about that. You think about what the audience is thinking about, and then you figure out a way to put that audience into the proper condition. It says there are 2 types, an introduction and an insinuation, and that depends on the auditor attitude. he talks about 5 different types of situation, from basically a hostile to a supportive. But really the point is that each of these has a slightly different sort of approach by the speaker, because each of these audiences are going to need a little bit different treatment to get into the proper condition to receive the rest of the speech. The ultimate goals are to make the auditor well-disposed, attentive, and receptive. So receptive seems to me kind of duplicative. I think the translator says that as well on the bottom of the page. But well-disposed is basically to be likely to accept the argument, whatever it is. And attentive is a slightly different point, that is, that actually pay attention and know what to pay attention to. He does try to envision every possible permutation of an audience attitude, and then what you would do for that. And that's what tends to make Cicero kind of difficult sometimes to process. And what I had suggested in the last video was that sometimes you just skip over when he goes into all these details here, and you just try to focus on the main points that he's trying to make. The basic point he's making on exordium is you adapt to the situation. So, and the particular situation that he's interested in is the auditor's attitude on the topic. Before he, well, as he's talking about the exordiums, he says, if the case permits, it is not unprofitable to begin with some new topic or a jest, either one which is extemporaneous, a kind which meets with uproarious applause and shouts of approval. To me, that sounded extremely modern. It sounds exactly like what people learn in Speech 101 or in Toastmasters. And I kind of love the way he says, something that would meet with uproarious applause and shouts of approval. Keep remembering, although we tend to think of this all as talking about writing, he is very much talking about an oral rhetoric. Or here's another spot that seems pretty modern. Surely the most obvious faults of exordia is or are they should not be general, common, interchangeable, tedious, unconnected, or out of place. This is on page 269, section 18. So what is a general exordium? Well, a general exordium can be tacked to many cases so as to seem to suit them all. And a common exordium is equally applicable to both sides of a case. Those of you who have taught freshmen or high school students, you know that there is often this kind of general or common, interchangeable, something that could be written by anybody and about anything that it doesn't give you any idea about what's to come. So we're going to look at a speech and talk about these components as we do this. I'm going to try to listen to it. So we're going to apply this theory to a speech given by Mitch Landrieu, the former mayor of New Orleans, in 2017, when he, in advance of a lot of other cities, took down Confederate monuments. I got this from that American Rhetoric website, and we will listen to parts of it and think about the parts of classical arrangement. So right now, we're going to listen to his introduction. And I want you to be able to read along, so we won't be watching him on the video. But later, I will share with you the PowerPoint, and you can watch the video version.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining me today. To my lovely wife, my first lady, a couple of days, we're going to be married 30 years. To the city council members, to Sergeant Kimmerer Woods, that was a beautiful rendition, didn't you think? Really nice. Representing the men and women of the New Orleans Police Department, Homeland Security, EMS, all of the individuals who have done really hard work over the last month under very difficult circumstances. And so Chief Harrison and Tim McConlin, our entire team at City Hall who are here today, and particularly Glenda and Mary, who are sitting at the front desk of City Hall, that has received all the warm blessings. I think they're watching right now, but before I came over here, I asked Mary how we were doing. She said, well, Chief, she said they called you everything but a child of God. To Matt Bailey and to U.S. Marine Corps retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard Westmoreland, who have been there every step of the way on behalf of the United States of America. Thank you for being strong. Pastor Anglin, to all the ministers who prayed and gave us strength. To Keith Plessy from the Plessy family, who brings our history from where it was to where it is today, and along with the Ferguson family, who are not here but have demonstrated what reconciliation really looks like. The descendants of Georgetown slaves, and to the New Orleans Freedom Riders. Diane Nash couldn't make it today, but Claude Reese is here, who was, give him a round of applause. Thank you all for coming today.
So what you see there is an exordium. It brings the mind of the auditor into a proper condition to receive the rest of the speech. And it makes the auditor well-disposed, attentive, and receptive. So you definitely see what he is doing is appealing to the audience. He's trying to make them laugh with his somewhat sarcastic point about all the blessings that they were receiving at the front desk. Obviously, they were not receiving blessings at the front desk. He doesn't exactly do uproarious applause and shouts of approval, but he does get quite a good applause. And it's the kind of humor that comes out of sort of a joint sense of difficulty, I guess one would say. And notice that probably above all, he's reaching out to all the people in the audience and connecting with them, trying to make some kind of human connection with them, empathizing with them, recognizing that what they did was difficult, that there was all sorts of conflict, and thanking them for being willing to do that and to, as he says, be strong. The next section of a classically arranged speech is the narrative. The narrative is, he says, is an exposition of events that have occurred or are supposed to have occurred. The speaker must tell his own side of the story carefully and clearly. Then in the textbook, he then goes on and talks about all sorts of different various details about narrative. But the bottom line is that the narrative is telling the story. What's the story here? Here, the story has to do with the history of Confederate monuments. And he's going to tell the story in his side of his perspective. So we're going to go back to Bitch.
The soul of our beloved city is rooted in a history that has evolved over thousands of years, rooted in a diverse people who've been here together every step of the way, through good and through bad. It is the history, our history, that holds in its heart the stories of Native Americans, the Choctaw, the Homa, the Chitimacha, Hernando de Soto, Robert Cavalier, Sir de La Salle, the Acadians, the Islanos, the enslaved people of Senegambia, free people of color, the Haitians, the Germans, both empires of France and Spain, the Italian, the Irish, the Cubans, the South and Central Americans, the Vietnamese, and so many more. You see, New Orleans is truly a city of many nations, a melting pot, a bubbling cauldron of many cultures. There is no other place quite like it in the world that so eloquently exemplifies the uniquely American motto, e pluribus unum, out of many we are one. But there are also other truths about our city that we must confront. New Orleans was one of America's largest slave markets, a port where hundreds of thousands of souls were bought, sold, and shipped up the Mississippi River to lives of forced labor, of misery, of rape, and of torture. America was a place where nearly 4,000 of our fellow American citizens were lynched, 540 in Louisiana alone, where our courts enshrined separate but equal, where freedom riders were beaten to a bloody pulp. So when people say to me that the monuments in question are history, well, what I just described to you is our history as well. And it is a searing truth. And it immediately begs the question, why there are no slave ship monuments, no prominent markers on public land to remember the lynchings or the slave blocks, nothing to remember this long chapter of our lives of pain, of sacrifice, of shame, all of it happening on the soil of New Orleans. So for those self-appointed defenders of history and the monuments, they are eerily silent on what amounts to historical malfeasance, a lie by omission. There is a difference, you see, between remembrance of history and the reverence of it. For American New Orleans, it has been a long and winding road, marked by tragedy and triumph, but we cannot be afraid of the truth. As President George W. Bush said at the dedication ceremony for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I quote, "A great nation does not hide its history. It faces its flaws and it corrects them." So today I want to speak.
So as an aside, I noticed that there was a stasis of definition there. He is saying that there's a difference between remembrance of history and reverence of history. And he wants to emphasize that they're going to remember history, but not necessarily revere it. But obviously what he just did is definitely narrative. It's a description of the events, the history, all its positives, and then all its negatives. Now, the next part of the speech is one that I think more people have some confusion about, just because the term is such a unfamiliar term and we might think of it as something else. But as he says on page 271 in section 22, a partition correctly made renders the whole speech clear and perspicacious. There are two types of partitions, he says. One is where you say, okay, so this is where we agree, and then this is where we are in disagreement. Sounds a lot also again about the stasis. Or type 2, which is what we're going to see with Landro's speech, where the speaker says, this is what we're going to talk about. The matters we intend to discuss are briefly set forth in a methodical way. This is a thesis statement. If you were in a speech class, you would be told that you should tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them what you already told them. It's this first one. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Cicero says, it is necessary to remind the orator that throughout the speech, he should bear in mind to complete the sections in order, one after another, as they have been planned in the partition. Follow the plan laid down in the partition, he writes. We see this in section 23, page 272. So let's listen to Mitch Landrieu again.
So today I want to speak about why we chose to remove these 4 monuments to the lost cause of the Confederacy, but also how and why this process can move us towards healing and understanding each other. So let's start.
So you have here a very classic partition as described by Cicero. He states what he's going to talk about. He is going to explain why they removed the monuments, and then he is going to talk about the future, how they can move towards healing and understanding. He is forecasting is another term that you may have heard for that kind of thing, and which is another way of describing a partition. So the next section is confirmation. This is where you provide support for the argument, and this is probably where we most typically think about argumentative speech giving and writing. He describes the confirmation as the part of the oration which by marshaling arguments lends credit, authority, and support to our case. He basically talks about a lot of different ways of supporting the argument, but along the way, he does address argumentation, and he talks about the irrefutable argumentation and the probable. Irrefutable is basically the deduction from a syllogism, which we were talking about previous weeks. Probable is based on induction from seeing what normally occurs. This is what normally occurs, so that's probably what has occurred in this case, would be the way the reasoning goes. Let's return to Mitch Landau and listen to his confirmation.
With the facts, the historic record is clear. Robert E. Lee, Jeff Davis, P.G.T. Beauregard statues were not erected to just honor these men, but as part of a movement which became known as the cult of the lost cause. This cult had one goal and one goal only: through monuments and through other means, to rewrite history, to hide the truth, which is that the Confederacy was on the wrong side of humanity. First erected 166 years after the founding of our cities, 19 years after the Civil War. These monuments that we took down were meant to rebrand the history of our city and the ideals of the Confederacy. It is self-evident that these men did not fight for the United States of America. They fought against it. They may have been warriors, but in this cause, they were not patriots. These statues are not just stone and metal. They're not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for. And after the Civil War, these monuments were part of that terrorism, as much as burning a cross on someone's lawn. They were erected purposefully to send a strong message to all who walked in the shadows about who was still in charge in this city. Now, should you have goals of the Confederacy, in the very weeks before the war broke out, the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, made it very clear that the Confederate cause was about maintaining slavery and white supremacy. In his now famous cornerstone speech, he said that the Confederacy's cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to a superior race, is his natural and his normal condition. This, our new government, he said, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Now, with these shocking words still ringing in your ears, I want to try to gently peel your hands from the grip on this false narrative of our history that I think weakens us, and make straight a wrong turn that we made many years ago, so we can more closely connect with the integrity to the founding principles of our nation and forge a clearer, straighter path towards a better city and towards a more perfect union. Now, last year, President Obama echoed these sentiments about the need to contextualize and to remember all of our history. He recalled a single piece of stone, a slave auction block engraved with a marker commemorating a single moment in 1830 when Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay stood and spoke from it. President Obama said, "Consider what this artifact tells us about history. On a stone where day after day for years, men and women, bound and bought, sold and bid like cattle on a stone, worn down by the tragedy of over 1,000 bare feet. And for a long time, the only thing we considered important, the singular thing we chose to commemorate as history, with a plaque, with the unmemorable speeches of these two powerful men. A piece of stone, one stone, both stories history, one story told, one story forgotten, or maybe even purposefully ignored." Now, as clear as it is for me today, for a long time, even though I grew up in one of New Orleans' most diverse neighborhoods, even with my family's proud history of fighting for civil rights, I must have passed by these monuments thousands of times without giving them a second thought. So I'm not judging anybody. I'm not judging people. We all take our own journey on race. I just hope people listen like I did when my dear friend Wynton Marsalis helped me see the truth. He asked me to think about all the people who have left New Orleans because of our exclusionary attitudes. Another friend asked me to consider these four monuments from the perspective of an African-American mother or father trying to explain to their fifth-grade daughter why Robert E. Lee sat atop of our city. Can you do it? Can you do it? Can you look into the eyes of this young girl and convince her that Robert E. Lee is there to encourage her? Do you think that she feels inspired and hopeful by that story? Do these monuments help her see her future with limitless potential? Have you ever thought that if her potential is limited, yours and my potential, my limited potential as well? We all know the answers to these very simple questions. When you look into this child's eyes is the moment when the searing truth comes into focus. This is the moment when we know what we must do, when we know what is right. We cannot walk away from this truth. Now, I knew that.
So what kind of support did he give for the argument? He basically retells the story of what the monuments, of what caused the monuments to come into play, showing how they were racist, segregationist actions rather than something that would honor. And then he also asks us to think about this from Black children's perspective, to sympathize and empathize and to try to put ourselves in their shoes. Note along the way too that he tries not to blame, and he says he's not trying to cast blame. He himself didn't really think about it with these monuments. But he is insistent that now that he does think about these monuments and society as a whole has begun thinking about them, that they have to go. The next section of the classical arrangement is refutation. This is where our textbook doesn't include it. I have these quotes from a different source. But refutation is what he calls the finding fault with the action which has been done, or the proof adduced by the opposite party is invalidated by arguing, or is disparaged, or is reduced to nothing. This sort of argument proceeds from the same source of invention which confirmation employs. Some people will talk about positive proofs in the confirmation and then negative proofs in the refutation. And basically, the simplest sort of refutation is to bring up an objection and then argue against it. You'll find lots of speeches that where refutation is much stronger than confirmation, that the argument gets its energy from bringing up the objections and then making the claim by refuting them. So let's listen to the section that Mitch Landrieu does.
On these monuments was going to be tough, but you elected me to do the right thing, not the easy thing. And this is what that looks like.
Oops.
So relocating these monuments is not about taking something away from someone else. This is not about politics. It's not about blame. It's not about retaliation. This is not about a naive quest to solve all of our problems at once. This is, however, about showing the whole world that we as a city, that we as a people are able to acknowledge, to understand, to reconcile, and more importantly, choose a better future for ourselves, making straight what has been crooked and making right what was wrong. Otherwise, we will continue to pay a price with discord, with division, and violence.
So you see here a very short section that's refutation, but he's definitely responding to the objections that have been raised. One of them that it was going to be tough, but it's the right thing. Another is it's not about taking something away from someone else. It's not about politics. It's not about blame. It's not about retaliation. It's not a naive quest to solve all our problems at once. All of these are objections to their actions. And he then responds to them by simply re-articulating what it is about. This we're about showing the whole world that we as a city are able to acknowledge, understand, reconcile, and more importantly, choose a better future for ourselves. Making straight what has been crooked, making right was wrong. Otherwise, we will continue to pay a price with discord, with division, and violence. The final section is the peroration, or the conclusion. The end and terminating of the whole oration is what Cicero says. He makes a big point about how at the conclusion you are, as I said earlier, telling them what you told them. He says, matters which have been related in a scattered and diffuse manner are collected together, and for the sake of recollecting them are brought under our view. Or he says, bring to the recollection of your hearers the reasonings by which you established each separate point. We proved this, we made this plain. And he also points out that you're refreshing the recollection, not repeating. There are other types of conclusions. One, he says, is to incite indignation, and the other is to move to pity. Both of these are to, I think, motivate people to action. And we all know the way in which movies provide these sort of stirring conclusions to movie speeches. And you know that it's a stirring conclusion because the music sort of swells and gets large. And you can hear that sort of perorating in Landrieu's closing.
After decades of public debate, of anger, of anxiety, of anticipation, of humiliation, and of frustration, after public hearings and approvals from 3 separate community boards and commissions, after 2 robust public hearings and a 6-1 vote by our duly elected city council, after review by 13 different federal and state judges, the full weight of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government has been brought to bear, and that is why these monuments are coming down in accordance with the law and will be removed. So now is the time to come together, to heal, and to focus on our larger task. Not only building new symbols, but making this city a beautiful manifestation of what is possible and what we as a people can become. And so let us remember the once exiled, imprisoned, and universally loved now Nelson Mandela, and what he said after apartheid. If the pain has often been unbearable and the revelation shocking to all of us, it is because they indeed bring us the beginnings of a common understanding of what happened and a steady restoration of this nation's humanity. So before we part, let us again state clearly for all to hear. The Confederacy was on the wrong side of history and humanity. It sought to tear apart our nation and subjugate our fellow Americans to slavery. This is a history we should never forget, and one that we should never, ever again put on a pedestal to be revered. As a community, we must recognize the significance of removing New Orleans Confederate monuments. It is our acknowledgement that now is the time to take stock of and then move past a painful part of our history. Anything less would render generations of courageous struggle and soul searching a truly lost cause. Anything less would fall short of the immortal words of our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, who with an open heart and a clarity of purpose calls on us today across the ages to unite as one people when he said, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. God bless you all. God bless you all. And God bless the United States of America.
Notice how at the conclusion he says, so before we part, let us again state clearly for all to hear, the Confederacy was on the wrong side of history and humanity. It sought to tear apart our nation and subjugate our fellow Americans to slavery. This is a history we should never forget, and one that we should never, ever again put on a pedestal to be revered. I think this is kind of an interesting speech in one regard, because it's an example of an epideictic speech, a speech that is expressing the values of a community. Remember, there are three types, big, large categories. Forensic, having to do with the judicial setting. Deliberative, having to do with the political setting of what we should do now. And epideictic, which is expressing the values of the community, and it's where the rhetoric becomes like a display rhetoric, using all your sort of bells and whistles to try to make it a really powerful, emotional kind of experience. And you certainly see him doing that in this speech, and especially the more and more sort of builds up to this kind of sort of large plea at the end. But just as Cicero said, he basically brought together all the disparate things that he'd said. He explicitly says, let me restate my point. And he definitely is using an emotional, pathetic appeals towards the end to kind of make everybody feel strongly that this expresses our values. So I hope this will give you an example of how you can apply the six steps or actions in a classical speech, which is we'll be doing in the discussion, and which you should have been doing all along in the blog. So hope this has been helpful to you.